He poured the wine directly on her dress and laughed like he had just erased her from the room. The deep red liquid spread slowly across the white silk fabric, staining it like spilled paint across fresh snow. Conversations around the ballroom dimmed into a strange half-silence, the kind that forms when people are unsure whether they should laugh or pretend nothing happened. The chandeliers above cast a warm golden glow across the marble floor of the Grand Lexington Ballroom in Midtown Manhattan, where some of the wealthiest families in American real estate and finance had gathered for the Caldwell Foundation Charity Gala. Ava Richardson stood perfectly still in the center of the moment, one hand lightly resting on the edge of the table beside her. She did not raise her voice. She did not step back. She simply looked down for a second at the wine, slowly dripping from the hem of her dress onto the polished floor. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair with a careless grin that revealed perfect teeth shaped by expensive orthodontists and years of private school confidence. His parents sat beside him at the head of the long table, dressed in tailored evening wear that quietly announced generational wealth. Margaret Caldwell gave a soft laugh as she lifted her champagne glass, her eyes scanning Ava from head to toe as if she were evaluating a stain on the carpet. Victor Caldwell, the real estate developer whose company had built half the luxury towers along the East River, chuckled under his breath and shook his head. "Well, that is unfortunate," he said calmly, as though the scene in front of him were nothing more than an amusing accident. Ethan shrugged with exaggerated innocence and lifted his empty glass. "I guess someone should have warned her not to stand so close to expensive wine." A few guests at nearby tables forced awkward smiles, unsure whether they were expected to join the laughter. Others turned away quickly, pretending to study the silent auction catalogs placed beside their plates. Ava slowly reached for a linen napkin from the table and pressed it gently against the fabric of her dress, absorbing the spreading stain with calm precision. Before we continue the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Now back inside the ballroom. The music from the string quartet continued softly near the far wall, their bows gliding across violins as if nothing unusual had happened. Waiters in black uniforms moved carefully between tables carrying trays of crystal glasses and silver platters of appetizers. From the outside, the gala still looked elegant, still looked perfect, but a quiet tension had settled across the room like invisible fog. Ava lifted her eyes again and met Ethan Caldwell's gaze. There was no anger in her expression, only a calm focus that made his smile falter for the briefest moment. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "people reveal more about themselves in a single careless moment than they ever planned to." Ethan laughed again, louder this time, as if the idea amused him. "Relax," he said. "It's just wine." His father leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice in a tone meant to sound generous, but carried the sharp edge of dismissal. "If you need assistance cleaning that up, the staff entrance is down the hallway to the right." Ava nodded once, still calm, still composed. Around them, the wealthiest investors in the room had begun whispering to one another. Some had recognized the name Richardson earlier when it appeared on the guest list. Others had not. And somewhere near the back of the ballroom doors, a tall man in a dark suit had just stepped inside, holding a slim leather briefcase and scanning the crowd as if he were looking for someone very specific. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The faint music from the string quartet continued drifting across the ballroom, but now every note seemed sharper, louder, as if the room itself had become aware that something uncomfortable had just happened in the center of the celebration. Ava Richardson calmly folded the wine-stained napkin once more and placed it on the edge of the table. The silk of her dress was still damp, the deep crimson color slowly spreading through the fabric, yet she did not rush or show embarrassment. Her posture remained straight, her movements deliberate. Around the Caldwell family table, several guests shifted uneasily in their chairs. One older investor cleared his throat and reached for his water glass, pretending to study the condensation along its rim instead of the scene in front of him. Ethan Caldwell leaned back farther in his chair, clearly pleased with the attention he had created. His cuff links flashed under the chandelier light as he stretched his arms along the back of the chair beside him like a man claiming a stage. "You see," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "people need to learn their place at events like this." Some of the guests forced thin smiles, uncertain whether they were expected to agree. Margaret Caldwell gently touched her son's shoulder with a look that suggested mild amusement rather than discipline. "Ethan has always had a dramatic sense of humor," she said lightly, as if she were explaining away a harmless prank rather than a public humiliation. Victor Caldwell lifted his champagne glass again, the golden liquid catching the warm glow of the chandelier above them. "Let us not ruin a beautiful evening over a spilled drink," he said with a smooth confidence that had helped him close countless business deals over the past 3 decades. Ava listened quietly. Her eyes moved once across the ballroom, taking in the tall marble columns, the white linen-covered tables, and the long windows overlooking the evening skyline of Manhattan, where the lights of the city shimmered like scattered stars along the East River. The Caldwell Foundation Gala had been designed to impress the wealthiest investors in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. A silent auction display stretched along the far wall, with framed photographs of future luxury developments planned by the Caldwell Company. At the center of the display stood a detailed architectural model of a waterfront resort project that Victor Caldwell had been promoting for months. Several guests nearby were discussing it quietly. "That development is supposed to be worth more than $650 million once construction begins," one man whispered to another. "If the financing closes tomorrow, it will be the largest hospitality project in the region this year." Ava turned her gaze briefly toward the display. The miniature towers and glass terraces of the model reflected the ballroom lights, each tiny window glowing as if the future buildings were already alive. Behind her, a young waiter approached nervously with a tray of fresh napkins. His hands trembled slightly as he held the tray toward her. "Ma'am, would you like another napkin?" he asked politely. Ava accepted it with a gentle nod. "Thank you," she said softly. The waiter gave a small relieved smile before stepping away again. Ethan watched the exchange and smirked. "See," he said, "even the staff feels bad for you. Perhaps you should let them escort you out before the stain spreads further across that dress." Victor chuckled under his breath again. Margaret took another sip of champagne. Yet while the Caldwell family continued their quiet laughter, a few people at nearby tables had begun watching Ava more closely. One middle-aged woman in a dark blue evening gown leaned toward her husband and whispered something into his ear. The man frowned slightly, studying Ava with a more careful expression now, as if trying to place a face he had seen before in a very different context. Ava slowly set the fresh napkin against the fabric of her dress again. Her voice, when she spoke, remained calm and steady. "It is interesting," she said, "how quickly people assume they understand who someone is." Ethan rolled his eyes and waved his hand dismissively. "Please," he said, "this is a private gala. Everyone important here already knows everyone else." Ava looked at him for a moment without anger, only quiet observation. Across the ballroom, the large double doors near the entrance opened again. A tall man wearing a charcoal gray suit stepped inside, carrying a slim leather briefcase. His eyes scanned the crowd with quiet urgency before settling on the center table where Ava stood beside the Caldwell family. The man began walking toward her with calm, purposeful steps, and although very few people noticed him yet, the direction of his movement would soon change the entire atmosphere of the room. The man in the charcoal gray suit walked steadily across the ballroom floor, his shoes making soft, measured sounds against the polished marble. Most guests barely noticed him at first because the Caldwell table still held the center of attention after the awkward moment with the wine. Yet as he moved closer, a few people began to recognize him. Conversations lowered into quiet murmurs. Ava Richardson noticed him immediately, but did not move. She simply folded the clean napkin once more and rested it lightly against the edge of the table, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. Ethan Caldwell was still leaning back in his chair, smiling with careless confidence. He glanced briefly toward the approaching man, but quickly lost interest. Another assistant for someone important, he said, with a lazy shrug. These events are full of them. Victor Caldwell continued speaking with two investors seated beside him, explaining the details of his upcoming waterfront development. Tomorrow morning, we finalize the investment agreement, he said smoothly. Once the financing clears, construction begins within 3 months. Margaret Caldwell listened with a satisfied expression, occasionally glancing around the ballroom to make sure the right people were hearing her husband describe the project. The architectural model of the resort remained displayed near the auction tables, its glass towers glowing softly under the gallery lights. As the man in the gray suit drew closer, several guests along his path stepped aside politely. He carried a slim leather briefcase in one hand and a tablet device in the other, though he never looked down at the screen. His eyes stayed fixed on Ava. By the time he reached the Caldwell table, the quiet tension in the air had grown strong enough that even Ethan noticed the change. The man stopped beside Ava and gave a respectful nod before speaking in a calm, professional voice. "Miss Richardson," he said, "I apologize for the delay. Traffic leaving the Midtown Tunnel was slower than expected this evening." A few guests at the surrounding tables exchanged confused glances. Ethan frowned slightly and leaned forward. "Miss who?" he said. Ava lifted her eyes toward the man, but remained composed. "Good evening, Daniel," she replied gently. "I assume you brought the documents." "Yes," the man answered, lifting the leather briefcase slightly. "The final review copies are ready for your approval before tomorrow morning meeting." Victor Caldwell paused in the middle of his conversation. For the first time that evening, his attention turned fully toward Ava. His brow tightened as if he were trying to place a name he had heard before. "I beg your pardon," he said carefully. "Did you say Richardson?" The man in the gray suit turned politely toward Victor. "Yes, sir," he replied. "Daniel Price, legal advisor for Richardson Global Investment Group." Margaret Caldwell blinked once, the polite smile fading from her face. Ethan looked from his father to Ava and then back again with visible confusion. "Richardson Global," Victor repeated slowly, the words sounding heavier now. That name had appeared on the preliminary financing documents for his resort project more than once during the past several months. Ava watched the realization begin forming across his expression. She did not rush to explain. She simply stood calmly beside the table, the faint stain of red wine still visible across the silk of her dress. Daniel Price opened the leather briefcase and removed a thin folder of neatly organized documents. He spoke quietly, but clearly enough for the nearby tables to hear. "The investment committee completed its final evaluation earlier today, Miss Richardson. They asked that you confirm the financing structure before the board call tomorrow morning." The silence around the table deepened. Victor Caldwell slowly set his champagne glass down. The small sound of crystal touching marble echoed far louder than it should have. His eyes remained fixed on Ava now, studying her face with sudden intensity. Ethan looked between them again, the confident smirk fading from his expression. "Wait a minute," he said, leaning forward with disbelief creeping into his voice. "Are you saying she works for Richardson Global?" Daniel Price did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Ava with quiet respect, waiting for her signal before continuing. Ava finally lifted her gaze toward Victor Caldwell. Her voice remained calm and measured, the same steady tone she had used since the wine first touched her dress. "It is not quite that simple," she said softly. Across the ballroom, the music from a string quartet seemed to fade into the background as more guests turned toward the table. Victor Caldwell felt a slow tightening in his chest as a single unsettling thought formed in his mind. Because the name Richardson Global was not just another investor in his project. It was the primary financing partner behind the entire $650 million development. And suddenly he was no longer certain who had truly been standing in front of him all evening. The silence around the Caldwell table grew heavier, as if the entire ballroom had suddenly begun listening without appearing to listen. Victor Caldwell remained perfectly still, his hand resting beside the champagne glass he had just set down. The confidence that had filled his voice only moments earlier now lingered in the air like a sentence that had been interrupted halfway through. Ava Richardson stood across from him, composed and steady, the deep red stain still spreading slowly across the white silk of her dress. The faint scent of wine mixed with the soft perfume of the gala flowers placed along the table. Centerpieces. Daniel Price remained beside her, holding the folder of documents calmly against his chest. Ethan Caldwell laughed once more, though the sound now carried a sharp edge of uncertainty. "This is ridiculous," he said loudly. "Everyone here knows my father is the one closing the financing tomorrow morning." He gestured casually toward the architectural model displayed across the ballroom floor. "That project belongs to the Caldwell Company." Victor raised a hand slightly, signaling his son to pause. His eyes never left Ava. "Miss Richardson," he said slowly, choosing each word with careful control, "perhaps there has been some confusion this evening. The Caldwell Development Group has been working with several financial partners during the early stages of this resort project. I assume your firm may be one of the minority investment groups." Ava listened without interruption. Around them, several nearby guests had begun turning their chairs slightly, pretending to follow their dinner conversations while clearly focusing on the exchange unfolding at the Caldwell table. The string quartet continued playing near the far wall, but even the musicians seemed to sense the tension building in the room. Daniel Price calmly opened the folder and removed a single sheet of paper. The document bore the official letterhead of Richardson Global Investment Group. He placed it gently on the table in front of Victor Caldwell. "Sir," he said respectfully, "Richardson Global is not a minority partner in the project." Victor glanced down at the document, but did not reach for it yet. His expression remained controlled, though a faint crease appeared between his brows. Ethan leaned forward and glanced at the page as well. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked impatiently. Daniel spoke clearly and calmly. "Richardson Global is the primary financing partner responsible for the full capital commitment required for the development." The silence that followed felt different from the earlier embarrassment in the ballroom. This silence carried weight. Margaret Caldwell slowly lowered her champagne glass, the polite smile finally disappearing from her face. Victor finally picked up the document. His eyes scanned the lines of text quickly. The letter confirmed the financial structure of the agreement scheduled to be finalized the next morning. The total investment commitment listed on the page was $650 million. The signature line at the bottom remained blank. Ethan shook his head with disbelief. "That does not make sense," he said. "We have been negotiating with the Richardson investment team for months." Victor continued reading quietly. The more he read, the more carefully his expression hardened into something far more cautious than before. Ava watched him patiently. Her voice remained calm when she finally spoke again. "Your legal team has been speaking with my office for several weeks," she said. Victor slowly lifted his eyes toward her again. For the first time that evening, there was no amusement left in his gaze. Only calculation. "Are you suggesting," he asked quietly, "that you represent Richardson Global in this agreement?" Ava tilted her head slightly, as if considering how much explanation was truly necessary. Daniel Price closed the folder again and stepped half a pace back, allowing her to answer. Ava reached forward and gently turned the document so that the signature line faced Victor more clearly. Her voice remained soft, yet every word carried across the silent table. "No," she said calmly. "I do not represent Richardson Global. I am the one who decides whether the financing happens at all." The words settled into the air like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. Margaret Caldwell felt her fingers tighten slightly around the stem of her glass. Victor Caldwell remained silent for a long moment, studying Ava Richardson with a completely new awareness forming behind his eyes. Because the woman standing in front of him was no longer simply a stranger at his table. She was the person holding the final authority over the $650 million project that could either expand his empire or stop it before it even began. Victor Caldwell continued staring at Ava Richardson as if the room itself had tilted slightly beneath his feet. The soft music from a string quartet still drifted through the ballroom, Yet now it sounded distant, like something playing behind a closed door. Around the table, several nearby guests had completely stopped pretending not to watch. Conversations had faded into quiet murmurs as more people slowly realized that the tension at the Caldwell table was no longer a simple social embarrassment. Ethan Caldwell looked from his father to Ava again, disbelief written plainly across his face. "That cannot be right," he said quickly. He pointed toward the document still resting on the table. "My father built this project. The financing was already arranged." Ava did not raise her voice. She simply folded the clean napkin once more and rested it beside the wine-stained fabric of her dress. The stain had darkened slightly under the ballroom lights, yet her posture remained calm and unshaken. "Financing arrangements are rarely as simple as they appear from the outside," she said gently. Victor finally leaned back in his chair. His eyes moved once across the ballroom, measuring the growing attention from surrounding tables. For a man who had spent decades controlling rooms filled with investors and developers, he understood very well when the balance of a conversation had shifted. "Miss Richardson," he said slowly, "perhaps we should continue this discussion privately." Ava looked toward him without hostility. "I believe the discussion already began publicly," she replied. Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose and shook his head. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "One moment she is standing here, covered in wine, and the next she claims she controls a $650 million investment." Victor raised his hand again toward his son, though this time the gesture carried more urgency. "Ethan, that is enough." Margaret Caldwell remained silent, though her composed social smile had long since disappeared. Her eyes moved between Ava and the document on the table, the realization gradually settling across her expression. Victor leaned forward again, his voice lower now. "Miss Richardson, I would like to clarify something before assumptions are made." Ava nodded once. "Of course." Victor tapped the document lightly with one finger. "The financing commitment from Richardson Global represents the final capital structure for the waterfront resort project. Without that capital structure, construction cannot begin." "That is correct," Ava answered calmly. Victor studied her carefully. "And the signature required to authorize that commitment must come from you." Ava gave a small nod. "That is also correct." The weight of the moment settled across the table again. Several guests at nearby tables had now turned their chairs completely, no longer pretending to ignore the conversation. Even the wait staff had slowed their movement through the room, sensing that something important was unfolding. Ethan rubbed his forehead with visible frustration. "This makes no sense," he said. "If you were the decision-maker behind Richardson Global, you would not be standing here alone at our table like some guest who wandered into the wrong gala." Ava allowed a faint smile to touch her lips, though. It carried no amusement. "Sometimes the most revealing moments happen when people believe no one important is watching," she said softly. Victor leaned back again, absorbing the statement. His mind was already moving quickly through the implications. Months of negotiations, legal drafts, meetings with financial analysts. All of it had been conducted through representatives and advisors from Richardson Global. Yet the final authority behind the investment had never once appeared in person. Until now. And unfortunately, the first impression his family had given that authority had involved a glass of wine and a room full of witnesses. Victor slowly inhaled and folded his hands together on the table. "Miss Richardson," he said carefully, "if my family behavior earlier caused offense this evening, I would like to address that immediately." Ethan looked toward his father with surprise. "Dad, you cannot be serious." Victor did not look at him. Ava observed the exchange quietly. Her expression remained thoughtful rather than angry. "Offense is rarely the most interesting part of situations like this," she said calmly. "What matters more is what people reveal about themselves when they believe power belongs only to them." The words settled heavily across the table. Victor Caldwell understood something in that moment that his son had not yet grasped. The evening had already moved beyond embarrassment. The real question now was whether the damage done by a single careless moment could still be repaired before the decision that would determine the future of a $650 million development. The air around the Caldwell table had changed in a way that no music or polite conversation could hide. What had started as a careless moment of humiliation now carried the quiet gravity of something far larger. Ava Richardson stood with the same calm posture she had maintained since the beginning of the evening, the faint wine stains still visible across the white silk of her dress. Daniel Price remained beside her, holding the leather briefcase with patient professionalism, his eyes scanning the room with the quiet awareness of a man who understood how quickly powerful rooms could shift direction. Victor Caldwell slowly leaned back in his chair and exhaled. For a moment he did not speak. He had spent most of his life negotiating with bankers, developers, and government officials. He knew when to apply pressure and when to step back. But what troubled him now was not the negotiation itself. It was the realization that the most important person in the entire deal had been standing at his table for nearly 20 minutes before he had even asked her name. Ethan Caldwell, however, had not reached the same conclusion. "This is completely ridiculous," he said, pushing his chair back slightly. "We are standing here acting like this is some kind of crisis because of a misunderstanding at dinner." He gestured toward Ava with open irritation. "She got wine on her dress. It happens." Victor turned his head slowly toward his son. "Ethan," he said quietly, "you are not helping the situation." Ethan threw his hands up. "Helping what situation? The deal is already done." Ava looked toward him without anger. "Deals are never done until the final decision is made," she said softly. Across the ballroom, several investors had now begun quietly gathering near the auction display, pretending to examine the architectural model while clearly watching the exchange at the Caldwell table. The small resort towers under the display lights cast long shadows across the tablecloths, as if the future of the project itself had become uncertain. Margaret Caldwell finally spoke again, her voice carefully measured. "Miss Richardson," she said, "I believe what my husband is trying to say is that tonight has been unfortunate, but surely something as small as an accidental spill would not affect a serious business agreement." Ava listened with thoughtful attention. She reached down and lightly touched the edge of the table, as if grounding herself in the moment. "The wine itself is not the issue," she replied calmly. Ethan shook his head with disbelief. "Then what exactly is the issue?" he demanded. Ava turned slightly so that both Victor and Margaret could see her expression clearly. "The issue is what the moment represented," she said. Victor studied her carefully. "And what exactly did it represent to you?" he asked. Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked briefly across the ballroom again. The tall windows reflected the Manhattan skyline outside, where the river lights shimmered against the dark water. Somewhere behind the string quartet, a waiter quietly refilled glasses along a distant table, though his eyes also flicked toward the unfolding conversation. Ava spoke again after a long, quiet breath. "It represented how easily people can mistake appearance for value," she said. Ethan laughed sharply. "You are reading far too much into a spilled drink." Ava looked at him again with calm patience. "Perhaps," she said, "but consider this for a moment. If I had truly been nothing more than a server standing near your table tonight, what would the outcome of that moment have been?" Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but stopped. The question hung in the air. Victor Caldwell understood the implication immediately. The difference between humiliation and consequence had only appeared once the room realized who Ava Richardson actually was. And that realization made the earlier laughter echo differently in his mind. Victor folded his hands together on the table again and spoke slowly. "Miss Richardson," he said, "I believe I understand the point you are making." Ava gave a small nod. "The real measure of character is how people treat someone when they believe that person holds no power at all," she said quietly. Around them the room had grown almost completely silent now, because everyone listening understood the unspoken truth behind her words. The Caldwell family had revealed exactly who they believed mattered in a room full of strangers. And unfortunately for them, the one person they had dismissed only minutes earlier was also the person who held the authority to determine whether their $650 million project would move forward or disappear before sunrise. The silence in the ballroom now carried a different weight. It was no longer the awkward quiet of a social mistake. It had become the heavy stillness that forms when an entire room realizes a line has been crossed and cannot be erased. Ava Richardson stood calmly beside the Caldwell table, the faint red stain across her dress now almost dry under the warm glow of the chandeliers. The silk had darkened slightly where the wine had soaked in, but she made no attempt to hide it anymore. Around the room, the quiet attention of investors, developers, and financiers had fully turned toward the table where the conversation had begun as a careless joke and slowly transformed into something far more serious. Victor Caldwell remained seated, his fingers lightly interlocked in front of him on the white linen tablecloth. His mind was moving quickly now, recalculating the situation with the same strategic precision that had built his company into one of the most powerful development firms on the East Coast. He knew exactly what was at stake. The waterfront resort project had already been announced to partners and investors. Architects had been hired. Environmental approvals had begun. The entire plan depended on the financing commitment that Ava Richardson controlled. Ethan Caldwell, however, still struggled to accept what was unfolding. "This entire conversation is absurd," he said again, though his voice now carried a trace of uncertainty he could not quite hide. He looked around the room as if searching for someone who might laugh and return the evening to normal. People spill drinks at parties. That does not suddenly turn them into the center of a business negotiation. Ava looked toward him patiently. "Negotiations rarely begin when people expect them to," she said softly. "Sometimes they begin when someone reveals more than they intended." Margaret Caldwell shifted slightly in her chair, her social instincts now fully alert to the fact that the room had become an audience. "Miss Richardson," she said carefully, "I believe what my husband and I are trying to express is that our family did not intend to disrespect you personally." Ava listened without interrupting. "Intent and impact are not always the same thing," she replied calmly. Victor nodded slowly. "That much is true," he said. He lifted his eyes again toward Ava. "But I would still like the opportunity to correct the situation if possible." Ethan turned sharply toward his father. "Correct what situation?" "Dad, you're acting like we just insulted a head of state." Victor finally looked directly at his son. His voice remained calm, but carried the firm tone of a man who had spent decades leading companies and boardrooms. "Ethan," he said quietly, "this conversation is no longer about your pride." Ethan leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated. Ava observed the exchange in silence. Her expression remained thoughtful rather than angry. Daniel Price remained beside her with the quiet patience of someone accustomed to high-level negotiations. He had seen many deals begin with polite smiles and collapse over far smaller moments of disrespect. Ava finally spoke again. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Caldwell," she said gently. Victor inclined his head slightly. "Of course." Ava glanced briefly toward the architectural model displayed near the far side of the ballroom. The miniature towers and terraces still reflected the soft lights of the gala, like a promise of a future that had not yet been built. "How many people will work on that project if it moves forward?" she asked. Victor answered automatically. "Construction alone would employ several hundred workers over the first 2 years. Once the resort opens, there would likely be more than 200 permanent staff members." Ava nodded slowly. "That is a great many livelihoods connected to one decision." Victor understood her implication immediately. "And that decision belongs to you," he said quietly. Ava did not deny it. The room had become almost completely silent now. Even the string quartet had reached the end of a piece and paused briefly before beginning another. Ethan looked from Ava to the document still resting on the table and then back to his father. "You cannot actually believe she would walk away from a deal this large over something this small," he said. Ava turned her gaze toward him once more. "The size of a deal does not change the importance of the values behind it," she replied. Victor studied her face again. He could see clearly now that she was not angry. That would have been easier to manage. What troubled him more was the calm certainty in her voice. Because people who spoke that way rarely needed to raise their voices to make decisions that changed the future of everyone in the room. And Victor Caldwell suddenly understood that the fate of his $650 million development now rested not on months of contracts and negotiations, but on the quiet judgment of the woman standing calmly across from him in a wine-stained dress. The quiet tension that had settled across the ballroom now felt almost physical, like pressure building before a storm. Ava Richardson remained standing beside the Caldwell table with calm composure, her posture steady despite the faint wine stain that still marked the front of her dress. The red had dried slightly under the warm glow of the chandeliers, but it remained visible enough that anyone looking could remember exactly how the evening had begun. Around the room, the guests had stopped pretending to focus on dinner or auction items. Wealthy investors, bankers, and developers stood in quiet clusters near their tables, their attention fixed on the unfolding moment. Victor Caldwell sat motionless, absorbing every word Ava had spoken. His experience in business had taught him how fragile momentum could be when pride entered a negotiation. He knew the difference between anger and conviction, and the calm certainty in Ava's voice told him she was not speaking out of emotion. She was speaking from principle. Ethan Caldwell, however, continued to struggle with the reality forming around him. This entire situation is completely blown out of proportion, he said with visible irritation. You're talking as if the future of this project depends on whether someone had a sense of humor at dinner. Ava turned her gaze toward him again, patient but unwavering. Respect is rarely about humor, she said quietly. It is about what people believe others deserve. Margaret Caldwell shifted slightly in her chair, her social instincts now fully aware that the reputation of her family was slowly being examined by every person in the ballroom. Miss Richardson, she said carefully, surely you understand that events like this are filled with small misunderstandings. It would be unfortunate if something so minor influenced a serious financial partnership. Ava considered her words thoughtfully. I do understand that mistakes happen, she replied. But the question tonight is not whether a mistake occurred. The question is what that moment revealed. Victor nodded slowly. He had already reached the same conclusion. The careless laughter from earlier now echoed in his memory with uncomfortable clarity. He looked toward Ava again, choosing his words with deliberate care. Miss Richardson, he said quietly, my company has worked for many years to build developments that benefit entire communities. This resort project will create hundreds of jobs and bring significant economic growth to the waterfront district. Ava listened attentively. I'm aware of the proposal, she said. That is why Richardson Global considered financing it in the first place. Ethan leaned forward again, his frustration growing. Then what exactly is the problem? He demanded. The project helps the city, it creates jobs, and it earns everyone involved a great deal of money. Ava looked toward him calmly. Financial success does not excuse a lack of character, she replied. The statement settled across the table like a quiet verdict. Victor Caldwell studied her expression again and realized something important. She was not threatening them. She was evaluating them. The difference was far more dangerous. Because threats invite negotiation, but evaluation invites judgment. Daniel Price remained silent beside Ava, though he noticed several people now slowly approaching the edge of the room to hear more clearly. The Caldwell name carried enormous influence in the development world, and the possibility that their largest project might be in jeopardy had become the unspoken topic of every conversation in the ballroom. Ava finally turned her gaze briefly toward the architectural model displayed near the auction area. The miniature resort towers reflected the lights of the room like glass promises waiting for approval. She spoke again after a moment. Projects of this scale do not only build buildings, she said softly. They shape the culture of the organizations behind them. Victor leaned forward slightly. And what culture do you believe my company represents? He asked. Ava looked back at him calmly. That is what tonight helped clarify, she replied. Ethan shook his head again. You are seriously judging an entire company based on one moment at a dinner table. Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked around the ballroom once more, meeting the eyes of several guests who had quietly gathered near the table. Many of them had witnessed the earlier laughter when the wine was spilled. Some of them now looked uncomfortable remembering it. Ava turned back to the Caldwell family and spoke with quiet certainty. Character is not revealed when people know they are being evaluated, she said. It is revealed in the moments when they believe no one important is watching. Victor Caldwell felt the full weight of her words settle across the table. Because in that moment he realized the most dangerous part of the evening was not the spilled wine or the public embarrassment. The real danger was that the person who held the future of his $650 million project had just watched his family show the world exactly what they believed about power, status, and respect. The room no longer felt like a charity gala. The crystal chandeliers still glowed warmly above the marble floor. The waiters still moved quietly between tables, and the string quartet had begun another gentle melody. Yet none of those things carried the same atmosphere anymore. The elegant ballroom had transformed into something closer to a silent courtroom where every guest had become an observer. Ava Richardson remained standing beside the Caldwell table, calm and steady, her voice quiet yet firm. The faint wine stain across her dress had dried completely now, but it remained visible enough to remind everyone how the evening had begun. Victor Caldwell leaned slightly forward in his chair, his hands folded together in front of him, as if he were considering a move in a chess match that had suddenly grown far more complicated than he expected. His mind was calculating every angle. The waterfront resort project was not simply another investment. It had been announced publicly, praised by city officials, and quietly celebrated by investors who expected enormous returns. Without the $650 million financing commitment from Richardson Global, the entire project would collapse before the first foundation was even poured. Ethan Caldwell, however, had reached the point where his frustration was stronger than his judgment. "You are acting like this dinner table moment somehow defines our entire company," he said sharply. "One misunderstanding does not erase decades of successful developments." Ava looked toward him calmly. "Success and character are not always measured by the same things," she replied softly. Ethan shook his head in disbelief and turned toward his father again. "Dad, this is completely insane. We cannot be standing here negotiating our reputation because someone decided to take a joke personally." Victor did not immediately answer. Instead, he studied Ava carefully, searching for any hint that her position might soften if he approached the situation differently. "Miss Richardson," he said slowly, "perhaps we should take a moment to separate emotion from business reality." Ava tilted her head slightly. "Go on." Victor gestured lightly toward the architectural model displayed across the ballroom. "That development will generate hundreds of jobs, attract tourism to the waterfront district, and create economic opportunity for the entire area. Those benefits will exist regardless of what happened at this table tonight." Ava listened without interrupting. Victor continued, "I believe responsible leadership means focusing on a long-term good rather than allowing a single moment of poor judgment to derail something valuable." The room remained silent as he finished speaking. Several guests nodded slightly, recognizing the familiar tone of a seasoned developer defending a project he had already invested years of planning into. Ava finally responded after a thoughtful pause. "Long-term good does matter," she said calmly. "But long-term good is built by people who understand responsibility in every moment, not only when a deal is at stake." Ethan exhaled loudly and leaned back in his chair again. "This is unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. Margaret Caldwell spoke quietly for the first time in several minutes. "Miss Richardson," she said, "perhaps what my husband is trying to explain is that our family has spent many years building trust within the development community." Ava looked toward her with a calm expression. "Trust is built through consistent behavior," she replied, "not only through successful outcomes." The words hung in the air with quiet weight. Daniel Price remained beside Ava without speaking, though he could see clearly how the conversation had shifted from negotiation to evaluation. Victor Caldwell recognized it as well. He leaned forward slightly again and spoke more directly this time. "Miss Richardson," he said, "are you suggesting that your decision regarding the financing will depend entirely on the impression formed during this evening?" Ava did not hesitate. "My decisions always depend on character as much as capability," she answered. Victor nodded slowly, absorbing the statement. He had built his career on financial calculations and strategic partnerships. But even he knew that reputation could influence opportunities just as strongly as capital. Ethan, however, was not ready to accept the lesson unfolding in front of him. You cannot honestly expect anyone to believe you would walk away from a $650 million investment simply because you felt disrespected at dinner, he said. Ava turned toward him one final time, her voice still calm, still steady. Money is never the most valuable asset in any partnership, she replied. Respect is. And in that moment, the entire ballroom understood that the future of the Caldwell development no longer depended on contracts, negotiations, or financial projections. It depended entirely on whether Ava Richardson believed the people behind the project deserved the power they were asking her to fund. The silence that followed Ava Richardson's last words settled across the ballroom like a heavy curtain. Even the quiet music from the string quartet seemed softer now, as if the musicians themselves sensed the fragile balance in the room. Victor Caldwell remained seated with his hands folded together on the white linen tablecloth, his expression calm, but far more serious than it had been earlier in the evening. Around him, the gathered investors and guests watched carefully, each person understanding that what happened next could shape the future of one of the largest developments planned along the East River. Ethan Caldwell, however, had reached the limit of his patience. "This is completely unbelievable," he said sharply, his voice rising slightly above the quiet murmur of the room. "You are standing here threatening to destroy a $650 million project because someone spilled wine during dinner." Ava Richardson did not react to the accusation. Her posture remained relaxed and steady, her hands resting lightly at her sides. The faint stain across her dress remained visible under the ballroom lights, a silent reminder of how the evening had begun. "I have not threatened anything," she replied calmly. Victor Caldwell finally spoke again, his voice measured and controlled. "Ethan, that is enough." His tone carried the authority of a man who had spent decades managing companies, boardrooms, and complicated negotiations. Ethan opened his mouth as if to argue again, but the look his father gave him forced him to lean back in his chair with visible frustration. Victor turned his attention back toward Ava. "Miss Richardson," he said carefully, "I believe I understand the position you are taking tonight." Ava nodded once, acknowledging the statement without interrupting. Victor continued slowly, choosing each word with the precision of someone who understood that pride had already complicated the situation once before. "You're not deciding whether the project itself is financially viable. You are deciding whether the people responsible for the project have demonstrated the character necessary to earn your trust." Ava studied him quietly for a moment before answering. "That is correct." The direct confirmation seemed to settle something in Victor's mind. He leaned back slightly and allowed a slow breath to leave his chest. "I see." Around the table, Margaret Caldwell remained silent, though her expression had shifted from social confidence to quiet concern. She could feel the attention of the entire ballroom resting on their family. The reputation that had taken decades to build now balanced on a single decision that none of them fully controlled. Ethan, however, still struggled to accept the gravity of the moment. "You cannot seriously be considering walking away from a project that will earn everyone involved millions of dollars," he said. Ava looked toward him with calm patience. "Money does not create trust," she replied. "It only reveals how people choose to use power once they have it." Victor listened carefully. His business instincts recognized the truth in her statement, even if the circumstances were uncomfortable. He knew that partnerships of this size required confidence between both sides, and confidence could disappear quickly once respect had been damaged. "Miss Richardson," he said quietly, "if the impression created tonight has raised concerns about her character, I would like the opportunity to address that directly." Ava tilted her head slightly, inviting him to continue. Victor rested his hands on the table and spoke with the calm clarity of a man who had learned that leadership sometimes required humility. "My son's behavior earlier this evening was careless and disrespectful. That is a fact I cannot deny." Ethan turned toward him with shock. "Dad!" Victor did not look at him. He kept his attention focused on Ava. A leader is responsible not only for his own actions, but also for the culture he allows around him. If my family created an impression that power excuses disrespect, then I must accept responsibility for correcting that perception. The room remained completely silent now. Ava studied Victor Caldwell carefully. She could see that his words were not simply a negotiation tactic. They carried the weight of someone who understood that influence came with accountability. Daniel Price watched the exchange quietly beside her, recognizing that the moment had shifted again. The conversation was no longer about defending a deal. It had become something far more personal. Ava finally spoke again, her voice calm but thoughtful. "Accountability is rare in rooms like this," she said softly. Victor nodded once. "That may be true," he admitted, "but it is still necessary." Ava glanced briefly across the ballroom at the architectural model of the waterfront resort. The miniature buildings reflected the light like a vision of a future that had not yet been decided. Then she returned her gaze to Victor Caldwell. "The real question," she said quietly, "is whether accountability is being offered because the situation demands it or because the principle behind it truly matters." Victor Caldwell did not answer immediately. The question Ava Richardson had asked did not require a quick response. It required honesty, and honesty was something that rarely appeared easily in rooms where pride and influence had long been the primary currencies. The entire ballroom seemed to pause as he considered her words. The crystal glasses on the table reflected the chandelier light in quiet patterns across the linen cloth. Several guests remained standing near their chairs, pretending to hold conversations that had already faded into silence. Everyone understood that the future of the largest development project in the room was now resting on a conversation about character rather than contracts. Victor slowly leaned forward and rested his hands flat on the table. When he spoke again, his voice carried none of the polished confidence he had used earlier while describing the resort project to investors. It carried something far more deliberate. "Miss Richardson," he said, "I have spent most of my life negotiating with people who measure success in numbers. Land value, investment returns, construction timelines." Ava listened quietly without interrupting. Victor continued, "But experience has taught me that the most expensive mistakes in business rarely appear on balance sheets. They appear in the kind of moments that reveal who people really are when they believe power protects them." Ethan Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He clearly disliked the direction the conversation had taken. "Dad," he muttered, "we are turning this into something far bigger than it needs to be." Victor did not look at him. Instead, he continued speaking to Ava. "Earlier this evening, my son behaved in a way that suggested status, allowed him to treat someone with disrespect." Ava remained still, her expression calm and attentive. Victor inhaled slowly. "If that behavior reflects the culture people associate with my company, then I have failed as a leader." The quiet weight of the statement settled across the table. Margaret Caldwell looked toward her husband with surprise. She had seen him dominate negotiations and silence competitors, but she had rarely seen him speak with such direct humility in front of an audience. Ethan, however, reacted differently. "This is unbelievable," he said under his breath. "You are apologizing to someone who is threatening to walk away from a deal that benefits everyone in this room." Ava finally turned her gaze toward him again. "I am not threatening anything," she replied calmly. "I am deciding what kind of people Richardson Global chooses to build the future with." Victor nodded slightly. "That is a fair position." Ethan leaned back in his chair and shook his head in disbelief. Ava allowed a quiet moment to pass before she spoke again. "Mr. Caldwell," she said gently, "when I arrived tonight, no one at this table knew who I was." Victor acknowledged the truth with a small nod. "That is correct." Ava continued, "In that moment, I was simply another guest standing near your table. Someone who appeared to hold no influence in the room." Victor understood where the thought was leading. Ava's voice remained steady. "And in that moment, your son chose to treat that person as if they were invisible." Ethan exhaled loudly again, clearly frustrated by the repetition of the story he wished would disappear. Ava, however, was not finished. "The most important part of leadership is how power is used when it encounters people who appear to have none," she said. Victor folded his hands together again and looked directly at her. Then allow me to ask you a direct question, he said quietly. Ava inclined her head slightly. Go ahead. Victor's voice remained steady. If my company proves that it understands the lesson in this moment, would you still consider moving forward with the partnership? The question settled across the room like a stone dropped into still water. Investors exchanged glances. Margaret Caldwell watched Ava carefully. Even Ethan stopped speaking long enough to hear the answer. Ava Richardson looked briefly toward the architectural model of the waterfront resort displayed across the ballroom. The miniature buildings still reflected the lights like a promise waiting to become real. When she finally turned back toward Victor Caldwell, her expression remained thoughtful but unreadable. Character is not proven through words spoken during a negotiation, she said softly. It is proven through actions taken when no agreement is guaranteed. The quiet certainty in her voice left the entire room wondering whether the lesson Victor Caldwell had just acknowledged would arrive too late to save the future of the $650 million development. For a long moment after Ava Richardson finished speaking, no one at the Caldwell table moved. The quiet in the ballroom deepened again, but this time it carried a different kind of tension. Earlier the silence had been driven by shock and embarrassment. Now it was driven by anticipation. Everyone in the room understood that the decision was approaching. Victor Caldwell remained seated with his hands resting on the table, his expression thoughtful and steady. The years of experience behind his eyes were visible now, not in the confident charm he had displayed earlier, but in the quiet humility that had slowly replaced it. He understood something that many powerful people refuse to admit. Authority meant very little if it could not survive moments of truth. Ethan Caldwell, however, had reached the point where frustration had replaced his earlier arrogance. He leaned forward again, his voice lower now, but still edged with disbelief. This is unbelievable, he said. You are telling us that everything depends on whether you believe we have learned some moral lesson tonight. Ava Richardson looked toward him calmly. Partnerships always depend on that, she replied softly. Ethan shook his head. No, they depend on profit and opportunity. That is how business works. Ava did not argue. She simply turned her gaze toward Victor Caldwell again. Mr. Caldwell, she said quietly, you asked whether your company could still move forward with Richardson Global if it demonstrated the values necessary to earn trust. Victor nodded once. That is correct. Ava considered the question for a moment before continuing. Tonight has shown me two different sides of your leadership. Victor listened carefully. The first was the culture that allowed someone at your table to treat another person with disrespect simply because they appeared unimportant. Ethan shifted in his chair again, but said nothing. Ava continued calmly. The second was your willingness to acknowledge that mistake in front of an entire room without attempting to hide behind status or influence. Victor remained silent, accepting the observation. Margaret Caldwell watched Ava with quiet attention, sensing that the final decision was approaching. Around the ballroom, the guests had drawn even closer, though most of them still pretended to examine auction items or sip their drinks while listening carefully. Ava spoke again after a brief pause. Leadership is revealed through both of those moments, she said. One shows what people believe they can get away with. The other shows what they're willing to correct when they recognize the truth. Victor slowly leaned back in his chair. And which of those moments carries more weight in your decision? He asked quietly. Ava allowed a faint, thoughtful smile to appear. That depends on what happens next, she answered. Ethan looked toward her again with visible impatience. What exactly do you expect to happen next? Ava glanced briefly across the ballroom, toward the large windows where the lights of Manhattan reflected across the dark water of the East River. Then she returned her gaze to the Caldwell table. Respect is not proven through speeches, she said calmly. It is proven through behavior when there is nothing to gain. Victor understood immediately. He turned his head toward his son. Ethan, he said quietly. Ethan looked back at him, confused. What? Victor's voice remained steady but firm. Stand up. Ethan blinked in surprise. What are you talking about? Victor did not raise his voice. Stand up and apologize to Miss Richardson. The words landed across the table with quiet finality. Ethan stared at his father in disbelief. You cannot be serious. Victor's expression did not change. Earlier this evening, you treated someone as if they were beneath your respect. Tonight you will correct that mistake. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Margaret Caldwell lowered her gaze slightly, understanding the significance of the moment. Ava Richardson remained completely still, offering no reaction or encouragement. This was not a demand she had made. It was a decision Victor Caldwell had chosen to make on his own. Ethan looked around the room and realized that dozens of eyes were now watching him. The same room that had laughed earlier was silent now. Slowly and reluctantly, he pushed his chair back and stood. His voice was stiff with discomfort. "Miss Richardson," he said, "I apologize for what happened earlier." Ava studied him quietly for a moment. The room remained silent, waiting for her response. Because everyone understood that even now the fate of the $650 million project had not yet been decided. For several seconds after Ethan Caldwell finished speaking, the ballroom remained perfectly still. The quiet apology hung in the air like a fragile bridge between the past few minutes and whatever would happen next. Ethan stood beside his chair, clearly uncomfortable under the attention of dozens of silent guests. His hands rested stiffly at his sides, as if he were unsure what to do next. Victor Caldwell remained seated but watched Ava Richardson carefully, understanding that the moment now belonged entirely to her. Margaret Caldwell sat quietly beside him, her earlier confidence replaced by something far more reflective. Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she studied Ethan's expression, not with anger, but with the calm observation she had shown throughout the entire evening. She could see that his apology was not yet comfortable for him. It had been offered because his father demanded it, not because he fully understood why it mattered. Yet the fact that it had happened at all had already shifted the tone of the room. Finally, Ava spoke. "Thank you for saying that," she said gently. Her voice carried, clearly across the table, soft but steady. Ethan nodded once, though he still avoided direct eye contact. Ava then turned her attention toward Victor Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell," she continued, "leadership is not proven by avoiding mistakes. It is proven by how those mistakes are corrected." Victor inclined his head slightly, accepting the statement with quiet respect. Ava reached toward the document that Daniel Price had placed on the table earlier in the evening. The paper rested exactly where it had been left, the signature line still empty beneath the printed commitment from Richardson Global Investment Group. $650 million in financing depended on the decision she was about to make. Around the ballroom, the guests leaned slightly closer, though none of them spoke. Ava lifted the document and studied it briefly. Then she looked back toward Victor Caldwell. "Your company clearly has the ability to build this project," she said. "The real question tonight was whether it also has the integrity to deserve the opportunity." Victor listened without interrupting. Ava continued calmly. "What happened earlier showed me a weakness in your culture. But what happened just now showed me something else." Victor's voice remained quiet. "And what was that?" Ava allowed a small, thoughtful smile. "Accountability," she answered. She placed the document back on the table and picked up the pen resting beside it. Ethan looked up in surprise. Margaret Caldwell slowly released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Ava spoke once more before signing. "A single moment does not define an entire future, but the willingness to learn from that moment can change it." With steady confidence, she wrote her name across the signature line. The soft sound of the pen moving across paper seemed louder than the music in the room. When she finished, she slid the signed document gently across the table toward Victor Caldwell. "The financing for the waterfront resort project is approved," she said calmly. A quiet ripple of relieved murmurs spread through the ballroom. Victor stood slowly and accepted the document with both hands, his expression sincere. "Miss Richardson," he said, "you have my word that tonight's lesson will not be forgotten." Ava nodded once. "I believe that," she replied. Ethan remained standing beside his chair, clearly still absorbing everything that had happened. Ava turned toward him one final time. "Respect is not about power," she said quietly. "It is about recognizing the value of people before you know what they can give you." Ethan gave a small nod, this time with genuine understanding beginning to appear in his eyes. A few moments later, Ava stepped away from the table and began walking toward the ballroom exit, Daniel Price following calmly beside her. The city lights of Manhattan shimmered through the tall windows as she passed. Behind her, the Caldwell family remained standing beside the signed agreement that had nearly disappeared before it even began. Because earlier that evening they had laughed at a woman they believed had no power in the room. Yet by the end of the night, that same woman had reminded them that real power was never about money or status. It was about character. And sometimes the most important lesson a person learns in business has nothing to do with the deal itself, but everything to do with the moment that almost destroyed it.